On June 18, 2014, it began as a typical hot summer day in the suburbs of Atlanta. The neighborhood where Tara and Leon Johnson lived was quiet and well-kept. The residents had known each other for years, children played in the parks, and neighbors exchanged greetings during evening walks. The Johnsons' home blended in, an ordinary two-story brick house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a car parked in the driveway. Tara Johnson, a 36-year-old housewife, went about her usual morning routine, making breakfast for her two children, 10-year-old Ivy and 7-year-old Malik. Leon, her husband, had already left for work, leaving a kiss on Tara's cheek as he always did early in the morning. At that moment, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Ivy was getting ready for summer camp, and Malik was preparing for his swimming lessons. It was just another day in suburban Atlanta. But by the evening, everything changed drastically. Around 8 p.m., Tara put the kids to bed as usual, following their strict schedule. Her husband Leon was working late, which didn't raise any suspicion as he often stayed into the evening, meeting clients or attending business events. However, that night, Tara felt an inexplicable sense of unease, as if there was tension in the air. She nervously checked her phone, almost expecting an important call, but the screen remained silent. By 10:30 p.m., a sharp knock echoed through the Johnson home. Standing at the door were two police officers, their faces serious, and something more than routine procedure was written in their eyes. The moment Tara saw them, she knew something terrible had happened. "Mrs. Johnson," one of the officers asked, his gaze steady on her. Tara nodded, her heart pounding and a heaviness settled in her stomach. "We regret to inform you that James Johnson was found dead in his home earlier this evening. We suspect a robbery gone wrong." Tara struggled to comprehend the words, but her mind refused to accept the information. She gripped the doorframe for support, her breathing shallow. The officers offered to come inside, but she just shook her head, unable to move. Their words echoed in her ears: "Dead, robbery, your father-in-law." Images of recent visits with James, her 76-year-old father-in-law, flashed through Tara's mind. He had been a strong man, a former police officer who had always been able to take care of himself. How could this have happened? She had no answers, only an overwhelming sense of dread. Soon, neighbors noticed the flashing lights of the police cars parked outside. Some peeked out of their windows, trying to understand what had happened, but no one dared step outside. In this neighborhood, such things were rare. While Atlanta wasn't crime-free, the suburbs had always felt safe, until now. Meanwhile, at James Johnson's house, 3 miles from Tara's home, the police were inspecting the crime scene. Blood on the carpet, a broken door, and several items scattered across the floor gave the impression of a chaotic robbery. But for the detectives on the scene, something about the situation seemed too neat. James had been sitting in his chair when he was shot, 2 bullets to the chest, both fired at close range. This didn't look like a random robbery. Someone had come here with a clear purpose. Detective Carlos Randall, the lead investigator, felt that something more sinister lay beneath the surface. His professional instincts told him this crime wasn't spontaneous. He noticed the subtle details, the way the furniture was arranged, the clean tracks on the floor, and most importantly, the locked windows. Why hadn't the man defending his home fired back or tried to call the police? While Randall studied the crime scene, the police interviewed James's neighbors. No one had heard anything, except for one resident across the street who mentioned seeing a black SUV parked near James's house about an hour before the estimated time of death. But that information didn't clarify who could have committed the murder. Back at home, Tara paced nervously, her thoughts racing as her anxiety grew. Something about the situation felt off to her. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to Leon, but there was no response. The phone remained silent, as did all the other means of communication she had relied on so meticulously in recent months. That night, Tara didn't sleep, waiting for Leon to return and trying to piece together the fragments of this unfolding tragedy. The year 2009 had begun tragically for the Johnson family. James Johnson, the now 76-year-old former police officer, lost his wife Loretta after a long battle with cancer. Loretta, always strong and full of life, had fought the disease for years, but eventually, it claimed her. James was left at a crossroads, having lost not only his wife, but also the meaning of his life. Her death left him empty, and he withdrew into himself. He was a man accustomed to controlling his emotions, but this time, the pain of loss completely consumed him. James started visiting his son Leon and daughter-in-law, Tara, more frequently, as they lived only a few miles away. Leon, always consumed by his work, spent much of his time away from home, focused on expanding his career in real estate. He was successful and ambitious, and his career demanded time, which meant he was often absent from family dinners, walks with the children, and even family holidays. Tara, on the other hand, was the one who maintained the household's harmony. She cared for the children, managed the home, and always made time to listen to James. At first, her sympathy seemed natural. She understood what her father-in-law was going through and felt it was her duty to support him during this difficult time. But with each visit, something began to shift in their relationship. It was hard to notice at first, but their conversations held more than just care and sympathy. One summer evening in 2009, after a family dinner, Tara served James his coffee as usual, and for a brief moment, their hands touched. That small, seemingly innocent gesture awakened something in both of them that they couldn't immediately explain. James's visits became more frequent. Leon didn't even realize how much time his father was spending at their home. While Leon chased big deals, often coming home late, James stayed for dinner, helped Tara with the kids, or simply sat with her on the porch, discussing recent events. Their conversations grew deeper, and although Tara tried to maintain distance, the emotional connection between her and James began to evolve into something more. By the fall of 2009, the tension was noticeable even to Tara herself. She found herself looking forward to James's visits with growing anticipation, while her feelings for Leon started to shift. Leon, increasingly absorbed in work, became more distant. His constant phone calls, client meetings, and late dinners with business partners left Tara feeling more and more alone and detached from her husband. One day in October 2009, during one of James's visits, Tara sat across from him at the kitchen table and they started talking. He spoke about Loretta, about how hard it was to adjust to life without her, and how painful it had been to watch her slowly fade away. Tara, vulnerable from her loneliness, found comfort in these conversations. They began to talk about life, love, and loss. That evening, they sat longer than usual, and when James was ready to leave, Tara walked him to the door, lingering in his embrace a moment longer than she normally would. She quickly pulled away, feeling guilty, but the spark had already been lit. With each passing month, their meetings became more personal, filled with an emotional closeness that Tara hadn't felt with Leon in a long time. She realized deep down that she was drawn to James, even though neither of them dared cross the delicate line between family and forbidden feelings. However, the tension between them grew, becoming harder to ignore. By the end of 2009, Tara found herself thinking more and more about James, though she knew these thoughts were wrong. Leon, consumed by his career, left an emotional void that his father filled. Their interactions began to take on the tone of a secret, slowly but surely eroding the foundation of family life. By December 2010, the tension between Tara and James had reached a point of no return. Their communication, once based on care and support, had taken on a new, deeply personal, and forbidden nature. After another family dinner at the Johnsons' home, where Leon once again was absent due to work, something changed. It was an ordinary winter evening. The house was filled with a festive atmosphere, Christmas lights softly illuminated the living room, and the kids were happily playing in their rooms. After dinner, Tara and James were left alone at the table. Her eyes met his, and for a few moments, a silence hung between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was charged with the tension they both felt but had never spoken aloud. That look marked the moment when their long-suppressed feelings surfaced. After dinner, as James prepared to leave, they lingered in the hallway longer than usual. Tara's farewell glance held more than words could express. James quickly looked away, feeling a wave of guilt, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the growing attraction he felt for her. A few days later, James made the first risky move. They met in a deserted parking lot in the suburbs where no one could see them. It was a meeting that should never have happened, but neither of them could resist the temptation anymore. They sat in his car, silence stretching between them until James finally broke it, confessing that he couldn't stop thinking about her. Tara, feeling the same, remained silent, but her gaze told him that their connection was far deeper than just fleeting thoughts. These secret meetings started happening more often. At first, they chose remote locations, old warehouses on the outskirts of Atlanta, abandoned houses no one visited. It felt to both of them like these places reflected their inner state, dark, abandoned, hidden from prying eyes. One day in January 2011, they met at an old deserted theater on Atlanta's southern outskirts. The theater, once a symbol of prosperity, now stood ruined and forgotten, much like their own lives, which they were desperately trying to hide from the world. Every time Tara went to these meetings, she felt like she was balancing on the edge between her normal life as a mother and wife, and the secret that was slowly consuming her. Each visit to these abandoned places brought her relief, but also overwhelming guilt. James felt his life unraveling too. As a former police officer, he knew all too well how dangerous it was to enter into such a relationship, especially with his daughter-in-law. Every time they met, he reminded himself that this should be their last encounter, but the pull of temptation was stronger than common sense. With each passing month, their affair became more and more risky. By March 2011, realizing that their regular meetings in the suburbs had become too dangerous, they decided to change tactics. Now, they met in old, abandoned buildings in downtown Atlanta left vacant due to the economic downturn. One of these places was an abandoned factory by the river, once a furniture manufacturer. Dirty and deserted, it became their hideaway. There, they could escape not only from the world but also from themselves. One day in April 2011, their meeting nearly ended in disaster. While they were in an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a patrol car stopped nearby. The police officers, not noticing James's car hidden in the shadows, were just patrolling the area, but the incident reminded them both of just how dangerous their relationship had become. James knew he wasn't only breaking the law but also jeopardizing his relationship with his son. Yet, every time he tried to end the affair, the temptation and the pull of their connection overcame him. Despite all the risks, neither Tara nor James could stop. Their meetings were filled with the thrill of danger, but that only heightened their passion. The guilt and fear of being caught intensified their relationship, making it even more intense. By June 2011, James felt the pressure mounting. His internal conflict grew stronger. He tried to distance himself from Tara, leaving town several times to avoid her, but each time he came back, unable to fight the guilt and desire. Leon Johnson had started to sense something was off in the last few months. His intuition, which had always helped him in business, now nodded him in his personal life. It started with small things. Tara had become more secretive. She often left her phone in her bag, kept it on silent, and avoided his direct questions about where she was going. These changes didn't escape Leon's notice, but for a long time, he tried to dismiss them, attributing them to stress or changes in their relationship. However, by March 2014, Leon's suspicions began to grow into real doubts. One evening, he came home a little earlier than usual and noticed that Tara had been on the phone, immediately ending the call as soon as he entered the room. Her face flushed, and her eyes avoided his. Leon didn't make a scene, but something clicked in his mind. He knew something wasn't right. From that moment on, he began noticing more oddities. Tara started leaving the house without warning, saying she had to meet friends or run errands, but she always seemed tense when she returned. When Leon asked where she had been, she gave vague or even defensive answers. Her behavior seemed too nervous, as if she was hiding something. One day, when Tara left for another meeting with friends, Leon decided to check her phone. He quickly realized that Tara had been carefully deleting all her calls and messages. This only fueled his suspicions. He began asking himself questions. What was she hiding? Why had she become so distant? These thoughts began to consume his mind with each passing day, and the tension grew. In mid-March 2014, a turning point occurred. Tara hurriedly left the house, leaving her purse on the kitchen table. Consumed by suspicion, Leon decided to take a look inside. He quickly rummaged through her belongings and found an old hotel key at the bottom of the bag. The key seemed strange, definitely not from their home or car, and certainly not from any other property he knew of. Leon felt a surge of anger rise within him. He instantly realized that this key wasn't there by accident. Leon, as always, chose to act cautiously. He didn't immediately confront Tara or accuse her. Instead, he took the key with him and the next day went to visit his old acquaintance, Private Detective Sam Griffin. Sam was a veteran, a former police officer known for his ability to dig up information even when it was carefully hidden. They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of Atlanta to avoid drawing attention. Sam was as cautious and professional as always. Leon briefly explained the situation and showed him the key. Sam examined it and frowned. He recognized it immediately. It was the kind of key used by one of the old motels in downtown Atlanta, the kind of places often used for discreet meetings or short transit stays. "This wasn't the type of place you go to for a meetup with friends, Leon," Sam said. "If this is what I think it is, we've got some work to do. But I'll need time to check everything out." Leon left the cafe with an even heavier burden on his heart. His suspicions had now turned into full-blown fear. It seemed to him that every step Tara took was a lie. From that moment on, he began keeping a closer eye on her. He noticed her leaving early in the mornings or late in the evenings, carefully choosing times when Leon would supposedly be busy at work. Every one of her absences seemed meticulously planned to avoid his suspicions. Leon started picking up on all the little things: new clothes, frequently changing phone passwords, and the frequent phone calls she took in another room. The more he tried to find answers, the fewer he seemed to get. His mind became consumed by paranoia. He couldn't focus on work, his thoughts constantly circled back to Tara. He felt like his life was falling apart, but he couldn't do anything until he knew the truth. Meanwhile, Sam Griffin had begun his investigation. He checked the motels, matched dates with Tara's movements, trying to figure out who she was meeting. Each day, without answers, turned Leon's life into more of a nightmare. He felt like everything was about to collapse, but didn't know how to stop. By the end of March, Sam had finally found a lead. He uncovered records of motel visits that aligned with the days Tara had been away. The evidence was piling up, and soon Leon would have to face something he feared more than anything. Leon Johnson waited anxiously for the results of the investigation. Paranoia ate away at him, but he knew he needed proof before he could take any action. He spent all of March in anxious anticipation, and every time Tara left the house, his suspicions grew stronger. However painful it was, he knew he couldn't act impulsively. He needed to stay calm if his suspicions were confirmed. In early April, during an early morning call, Sam Griffin told him there were updates. The detective suggested they meet at the same cafe on the outskirts where they had discussed the case before. Filled with grim anticipation, Leon went there the same day. When Sam handed him the envelope with the photos, Leon felt a chill in his chest. He slowly opened the envelope, looking at the series of pictures. The first photos showed Tara, his wife, and his 76-year-old father entering an old motel on the outskirts of Atlanta. Tara looked cautious, glancing around, while James seemed more relaxed. Their bodies moved in sync, and every photo spoke more than words ever could. Something inside Leon snapped, as though his life had just lost its last threads of normalcy. This wasn't just an affair, it was a betrayal from both sides, his wife and his father. Tara, the person he trusted the most, and James, his mentor, had become strangers to him. Leon sat in the cafe, flipping through the photos, feeling a wave of rage wash over him. But along with the fury came a cold clarity. He couldn't act on impulse. Leon understood that an open confrontation would only bring more pain and destruction. Instead, he decided to use this information wisely. If his father and wife had been hiding their affair for this long, they must have been afraid of being found out. And now, he could use their fear against them. Sam suggested a discreet approach, but Leon had already begun formulating his own plan, calculated, methodical, and designed to unfold over time. Rather than confronting them directly, Leon decided to start with James. He knew his father was a man who thrived on control, someone used to hiding emotions. He needed to make James believe that everything was under control, that no one suspected a thing. To do this, Leon started small, casual conversations, subtle hints about family matters. He began inviting James over more often to discuss insignificant issues. James, unaware of the trap, began to relax, thinking their secret was still safe. Meanwhile, Leon subtly manipulated the situation. He chose moments when he could talk to James alone, hiding his true feelings. One day, during one of their conversations, he dropped a few phrases that sounded like harmless questions, but were actually meant to plant seeds of doubt in James's mind. "How's Tara's mom doing? She visited recently, right?" he asked one day. James froze for a moment, realizing it was a veiled reference to his frequent absences. At the same time, Leon continued to play the role of the loving husband, though inside, he was seething with hatred. He deliberately stayed late at work, giving Tara a false sense of security. He tracked her movements, documenting every step. Meanwhile, he developed his strategy, methodically planning how to push both Tara and James to psychological ruin. One evening, when James came over for dinner, Leon mentioned in passing that he had to go on a business trip for the weekend. In reality, it was a trap. He wanted to see how James and Tara would use his absence. James, unaware of the setup, seemed relaxed. Leon noticed how James grew more confident, believing that everything was going according to plan. But that was exactly what Leon wanted. "Leon, what are you doing here?" James asked, sensing that something was wrong, but Leon silently stepped closer, his face expressionless, his eyes burning with cold determination. Before James could say anything more, he saw Leon pull out a gun. In a split second, 2 gunshots rang out, shattering the night's silence. The first shot hit James in the chest, sending him reeling back. The second came as he was already falling. Silence filled the room after the echo of the gunshots faded. Leon stood motionless for a few moments, watching as his father collapsed to the floor, blood slowly pooling across the carpet. In that moment, he felt neither relief nor regret, only a cold emptiness inside. He had expected the murder to bring him self-satisfaction, but instead, it all felt even more pointless. But Leon didn't allow himself time for reflection. Everything had to be done quickly and precisely. He had already planned how to stage the scene to make it look like a botched robbery. He swiftly wiped away any trace of his actions, putting on gloves, carefully wiping down the gun before placing it next to James's body to make it seem as though he had tried to defend himself. The room was left in disarray, scattered documents, an overturned chair. Everything had to look chaotic, yet believable enough for sloppy burglars. However, the key element of Leon's plan was to leave evidence of James's affair with Tara next to his body. Leon had already prepared several letters and photos documenting their meetings. He placed these items in a bag next to James's body, subtly hinting that the affair was the reason for James's death. Leon knew that if the police found these documents, it would be enough to suggest personal motives behind the murder while still making it look like a robbery that accidentally exposed their secret. Leon was confident that his plan was flawless. Staging the robbery and hinting at the secret affair would create a complicated case for the investigation. After finishing the setup, Leon calmly left the house, carefully closing the door behind him. He returned home as if nothing had happened. His mind was clear. There was no panic, only a precise plan of what to do next. Leon knew that the morning would bring police sirens, phone calls, and interrogations, but he was prepared for it all. He was confidently following the script he had written. The next morning, June 19, 2014, James Johnson's house was surrounded by police cars. Neighbors gathered by their windows, watching the scene in disbelief, unable to fathom that such horror could happen in their neighborhood. The news of his death spread across Atlanta, shocking and puzzling his friends and acquaintances. James Johnson, a former police officer who knew how to protect himself, had been found dead, and the crime scene looked like a robbery gone wrong. Investigators began examining the crime scene with a certain bias. The initial theory was that it was a robbery where something had gone wrong. The room was indeed chaotic, the door had been broken down, papers were scattered, and a chair was knocked over. Everything pointed to a sloppy break-in. But seasoned detective Carlos Randall, who had taken on the case, immediately sensed that something was off. His first suspicion arose when he examined James's body closely. The 2 gunshots were delivered at close range, precise hits, not the usual mark of a panicked robber. Additionally, James had been found sitting as if he hadn't anticipated any threat. Could this robbery have been staged? This question nagged at Randall from the very start of his investigation. As the investigators dug deeper into the details, they uncovered something even more intriguing: a folder with letters and photographs neatly placed next to James's body. These documents clearly related to his secret affair with Tara, James's daughter-in-law. This added a new layer to the case. It no longer seemed like just a robbery. The affair they had been hiding was suddenly out in the open. Randall knew these documents were left deliberately. Obvious clues rarely appeared by accident. It seemed like someone wanted the detectives to focus on the affair and make it the centerpiece of the investigation. But who would have a motive to kill James and leave such suggestive evidence behind? The police immediately summoned Tara for questioning. When she arrived at the station, her face was contorted with horror and fear. Tara quickly realized that their secret was out, and she was terrified that everything would unravel right before her eyes. During questioning, she tried to hold it together, but under pressure, Tara admitted to the affair with James. Her confession became a key detail that gave the investigation a new direction. However, she adamantly denied any involvement in the murder. Detectives couldn't ignore her confession, but at the same time, they began to suspect that someone else was behind the crime. Another important figure needed to be questioned: Leon Johnson. He was Tara's husband and James's son. Leon clearly had motives: revenge for the betrayal, a desire to punish the people who had deceived him. But his behavior in the days following the murder raised more questions than answers. He seemed calm, even cold, which didn't align with how a man who had lost his father and discovered his wife's betrayal should react. When Leon was called in for questioning, he remained composed and restrained, as if nothing unusual had happened. He answered the detectives' questions clearly, providing an alibi for the time of the murder, claiming he had been at home working on business matters. However, his alibi was weak, as no one could confirm his whereabouts. Meanwhile, Randall and his team began uncovering more inconsistencies at the crime scene. It turned out that there were fewer signs of a struggle than expected. At first glance, the scene appeared chaotic, but upon closer inspection, it became clear that it had been staged too carefully. Furthermore, the gun found near James's body hadn't left any gunpowder residue on his hands, indicating that he hadn't fired it. The investigators also conducted a thorough examination of the letters and photographs left next to the body. They concluded that someone had deliberately planted these documents to steer the investigation in a particular direction. But that someone had clearly underestimated the detectives' attention to detail. Randall's suspicion of Leon grew stronger. Despite Leon's outward calm, his behavior seemed too controlled, as if he was following a pre-planned script. However, the police didn't have direct evidence linking him to the murder. Everything hinged on circumstantial evidence that could easily fall apart in court. By the end of June 2014, investigators began to realize that Leon had skillfully concealed his involvement. His cold calculation, meticulous planning, and manipulation of the evidence had made him nearly untouchable. But Randall wasn't giving up. He continued watching Leon closely, knowing that even the slightest mistake could reveal the truth. July 2014 became the turning point in the investigation into James Johnson's murder. Despite Leon's tricks and carefully thought-out plan, one small misstep put him in the crosshairs. From the start, Leon had seemed almost invincible, but experienced detectives like Carlos Randall knew that every perfect crime always had a weak link. For weeks after the murder, the police couldn't find direct evidence connecting Leon to the crime. The clues pointed to possible motives, but there was no concrete proof to press charges. Leon had expertly manipulated the situation, leaving the investigators confused. But one small, seemingly insignificant detail changed everything. During another search of Leon's garage, one of the detectives came across a pair of old work gloves. At first glance, it seemed like a trivial detail, easy to overlook. However, being professionals, the investigators decided to conduct a forensic analysis. This decision turned out to be pivotal. Microscopic traces of gunpowder were found on the gloves, matching those found at the crime scene. These faint traces, though barely noticeable, directly linked Leon to the gunshots that had killed his father. Leon was in shock when he was informed of the discovery. He thought he had covered all his tracks, but that tiny trace left on the gloves became his fatal mistake. The police immediately pressed charges. On July 15, 2014, Leon was arrested at his home. As the handcuffs were placed around his wrists, his icy composure began to crack. He realized that everything he had carefully built had collapsed. Meanwhile, Leon's paranoia only grew stronger. He became obsessed with controlling every move Tara and James made. Leon started recording Tara's phone conversations, checking her emails, and even installed hidden cameras in the house to monitor their interactions. Every time they were alone, Leon analyzed their conversations, their glances, and gestures. He knew that through them, he would find the weak spots he could exploit. By the end of April, Leon was ready to make his next move. His plan for revenge was nearly complete. He intended to gradually destroy the trust between Tara and James, pushing them towards self-destruction. But this was only the first part of his carefully crafted scheme. May 2014 began for Leon Johnson with a clear plan. Now that he had all the evidence and control over the situation, it was time for the next move. He had transformed into a cold strategist, masterfully orchestrating his revenge. In his mind, there was no more room for pity or pain, only for a calculated game where he was the director, and Tara and James were his puppets. Leon started by subtly amplifying the fears and insecurities of Tara and James. He knew their affair was built on secrets, and every hint of exposure slowly eroded them from within. His behavior became even more composed and calculated. Leon carefully inserted hidden hints into their conversations, never directly, always subtly and cautiously. This created a false sense of security for Tara and James. They thought he still didn't know, but every gesture, every word Leon spoke was designed to make them nervous. Leon acted as if he suspected nothing, continuing to play the role of the perfect husband and son. He invited James over for dinner, kept calmly talking to Tara, and pretended his life was the same as before. But behind his calm exterior was a meticulously planned performance. Secretly, Leon had installed hidden cameras in the house where Tara and James often met, recording their conversations and tracking their every move. These recordings were part of his plan, to be used at just the right moment. At the beginning of May, Leon started gradually pushing the situation toward a climax. He arranged several casual meetings with Tara, where he subtly made her feel guilty. One morning, as they sat at breakfast together, he casually remarked, "You seem a bit distant lately, like something's bothering you." Tara nervously laughed it off, assuring him everything was fine, but her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. Leon saw her fear, and it only strengthened his control over the situation. By mid-May, Leon was ready for the decisive step. He meticulously planned everything so that the confrontation would go exactly as he wanted. The choice of location was strategic, James's empty house while he was at work. Leon invited Tara there under the pretense of discussing family matters. Tara, suspecting nothing, arrived at the scheduled time. When she walked into the house, Leon was sitting at the table in the living room, with an envelope containing photos and video recordings lying on the table. He was calm, his gaze cold, and that immediately unsettled Tara. She asked what was wrong, but Leon simply gestured toward the envelope. Tara slowly approached the table, took the envelope, and upon opening it, saw the pictures of her and James entering the hotel. Her hands began to tremble as she realized her secret had been exposed. Leon didn't say a word, just watched her, observing her reaction. The silence in the room was deafening. Tara tried to explain herself, stumbling over her words, but Leon remained ice cold. "How long has this been going on?" he asked quietly, his voice chilling. Realizing there was no escape, Tara broke down in tears, confessing everything. She begged for Leon's forgiveness, trying to explain that it had all been a mistake, that she didn't know how to stop. But Leon showed no emotion. His face remained expressionless, which frightened Tara even more. She had expected yelling, anger, but his cold detachment was far worse. "You think I didn't know," he continued. "I've known everything from the start. I've watched your every move. Did you really think you could hide this? Tara was in despair. Her pleading words found no response, and Leon continued to methodically break her down, explaining how he had been watching them for so long, carefully planning this moment. She began to realize that he had been playing with them the entire time, and the realization left her feeling terrified and helpless. Having achieved the desired effect, Leon didn't continue the interrogation. He stood up, casting one final cold glance at Tara and said, "Your life is in my hands now." His words sounded like a sentence. Tara, completely broken, remained in the house, understanding that her world had been shattered beyond repair. Leon, on the other hand, left James's house, feeling as if his plan was finally taking shape. Now Tara was under his control, just like James, who had no idea that his own confrontation was imminent. But this was only the first stage. Leon was determined to see his game through to the end. June 18, 2014, began as a typical evening for James Johnson. He was planning another meeting with Tara, unaware that this time, things wouldn't go as planned. As usual, James carefully prepared himself, thinking about how to keep his affair with his daughter-in-law hidden from his son. He had thoughts about how risky their affair was becoming, but he couldn't stop himself. He believed they were still safely under the veil of secrecy, that no one knew what was going on, but Leon had planned everything for weeks. He had been creating the illusion that his suspicions had faded, that he had left them alone, but this was all a ruse. Leon knew that Tara and James would continue their meetings, and he was waiting for the perfect moment. By this point, Leon had become completely consumed with thoughts of revenge. His entire focus was on how to kill James and make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He had carefully planned every step, from the choice of weapon to the details that would help cover up his involvement. That evening, Leon decided it was time to act. He knew that James was expecting Tara at his house, but instead of her, James was greeted by Leon. Without giving his father a chance to explain or understand, Leon calmly entered the house. James, seeing his son, tensed up, not expecting his visit. His face reflected surprise, quickly turning to concern when he noticed the coldness in Leon's eyes. During the arrest, Leon tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed the internal panic. He knew the game was nearly over. Neighbors, watching the scene, couldn't believe that the man they considered an upstanding member of the community was involved in such a heinous crime. The news of Leon's arrest quickly spread through the town, shocking everyone who knew him. As the trial began, even more shocking details surfaced about how Leon had manipulated everyone around him. Prosecutors presented the recordings found at the crime scene, along with witness testimonies and forensic evidence. But what truly shocked the court was how deeply Leon had engaged in psychological manipulation. The trial revealed how Leon deliberately led his wife Tara and his father James to their own self-destruction. He had known about their affair long before he decided to act. Instead of immediately confronting them or causing a scene, Leon used his knowledge to manipulate them, creating a false sense of security. The psychological pressure he applied to Tara and James was designed to make them feel guilty and fearful without realizing that he was preparing for far more brutal revenge. Tara's testimony in court stunned the public. She described how Leon had systematically destroyed her confidence, playing on her fears and guilt. Leon never yelled or directly threatened, but his cold demeanor and subtle hints were far scarier than open aggression. He left Tara in a constant state of panic, preventing her from realizing how deep into his game she had already descended. But the most powerful moment came when the hidden camera footage installed by Leon in James's home was shown in court. The footage revealed how meticulously Leon had planned every step, watching Tara and James's every move, recording their interactions. Prosecutors showed video clips where Leon analyzed his plans to himself, discussing the actions of his victims and strategizing as if it were a chess match. These tapes not only confirmed his involvement in the murder, but also demonstrated how deeply he had manipulated everyone around him. As the judge heard all the arguments and reviewed the evidence, he remarked that he had never seen such a level of calculation and manipulation in his entire career. Leon, who once appeared calm and in control, now seemed broken and empty. On July 20, 2014, Leon was officially charged with first-degree murder. He was facing life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His cold-blooded manipulation and carefully staged crime, which he believed would make him untouchable, ultimately backfired. The trial of Leon Johnson, which began in August 2014, became a media sensation. For the residents of Atlanta and across the country, the press followed every detail, and the headlines were filled with speculation about what had happened in the life of a man who had seemed so perfect. Leon, accused of murdering his own father, appeared in court cold and confident. From day one, he played his role to perfection, the loving but betrayed husband, deceived by the people closest to him. When Leon entered the courtroom, he appeared calm. His demeanor immediately drew attention. He showed no fear or remorse, only calmness and readiness to defend his innocence. He became the embodiment of a dramatic role for journalists and the public, the betrayed husband at the center of a dark family drama. It seemed as though his behavior was winning the sympathy of the jury and the public, who were ready to believe in his innocence. However, Detective Carlos Randall and his team knew that this outward calm was just part of the act. From the first days of the trial, they began to unravel Leon's manipulations. The early days of the trial focused on presenting the evidence, the gunpowder residue on the gloves, the records left next to James's body, and the surveillance footage found in James's house. All these clues slowly dismantled the image of an innocent husband. The most shocking moment came when footage was presented showing Leon analyzing and planning every step. The videos, which he had recorded for his own reassurance, now became his downfall. They showed how Leon meticulously planned his revenge, devised psychological manipulations, and discussed with himself all possible outcomes. The jury and the public watched in horror as Leon coldly explained his motives and intentions. Every day of the trial was tense. Witness after witness took the stand to share what they knew about Leon and his family. Close friends and colleagues began recalling the odd behavior he had exhibited in the months leading up to the murder. Some mentioned his controlling nature, while others recalled that he had hinted at Tara's possible infidelity, but he never crossed the line into direct accusations. But the most emotionally charged moment of the trial was Tara's testimony. When she took the stand, she looked defeated and broken. Her face reflected the fear and pain she had endured over the past months. Under oath, she recounted how Leon had manipulated both her and James, making them feel guilty while secretly preparing horrific revenge. Tara admitted that she had sensed from the beginning that Leon knew something, but she had never imagined how far he had gone with his plans. Prosecutors seized every opportunity to show how Leon had masterfully controlled the situation, creating the illusion of a normal life while secretly laying the groundwork for murder. His cold-bloodedness and ability to manipulate others became the foundation of the case. Legal experts noted that this wasn't just a murder, it was a meticulously crafted psychological game that Leon had played, ruining the lives of everyone around him. The trial unfolded like a true thriller. Every day revealed more details about how Leon had constructed his web of lies. Even when the defense attorneys tried to paint him as a victim of circumstances, the overwhelming evidence destroyed that narrative. Witness testimonies and video footage left the jury in shock. The final blow came during Detective Randall's testimony. Step by step, he unraveled the full extent of Leon's manipulations. He presented every detail of the investigation, how Leon had staged the robbery, how he had used his knowledge of human behavior to make Tara and James believe they could keep their affair hidden. But the key point was that Leon had always intended to punish them, and his entire life in the months leading up to the murder had been devoted to crafting the perfect crime. In mid-September 2014, the jury delivered their verdict. Leon Johnson was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For everyone who followed the trial, it was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a story of how one man could manipulate people so deeply that they didn't even realize they had become his victims. Leon, who had remained calm until the very end, now sat in prison. But his manipulations and mind games would remain in the memories of those involved for a long time. Handcuffs were placed around his wrists, his icy composure began to crack. He realized that everything he had carefully built had collapsed.